Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. Hello. Welcome in. Glad to see you here. Hello to everyone in the chat who was here early. Welcome in on this Sunday in the Western Hemisphere, Monday in the Eastern Hemisphere live stream we got going on here. Let's go. Hello. Welcome, friends, to Alpha Beta Soup. I'm TXMC. Welcome in. It is beautiful April 21st, 2024, where I live, 6 p.m. U.S. Central Time. Welcome. We may have some friends joining us from Australia or Japan or whomever else was in the comments not too long ago saying they'd like some later streams. Hello, everyone. So today, being a Sunday, I'm feeling a little chill. And what we're going to do today is we're not going to do market analysis today. So if that's what you came for, you'll have to wait for a stream this week that we'll do. We'll also have a member stream later this week. So if you'd like to be part of the private stream where it's not me coming in with a monologue, we just kind of hang out and shoot the breeze, and I spend pretty much the whole time just answering questions and talking to chat, then you can consider, I think it's like $5, throwing $5 at YouTube and doing the join channel option and becoming a channel member, and you can come join those. Not required. We'll still do a live public stream like we always do in a few days later this week. But today, I have a presentation for you. What I want to talk about, as you may have guessed from the title of the video, we're going to talk about Paul Volcker slaying the inflation dragon. It's a period of time that people reference all the time. And I think it would be really interesting for us to talk about it a bit, and let me show you behind the curtain on some of the things I've learned about that era. And we'll hear from the man himself, Mr. Volcker. There's a couple of different books that he's talked about this, but one in particular that is called Changing Fortunes. And I love it. I read it last year, and I think it was last year or the year before. I've read it in the last couple of years, and it's been one of my favorite things I've read recently. And what I want to do is show you guys, we're going to read some excerpts from there, which are in Paul Volcker's own words. We'll have a few charts along the way. And what I think is interesting, and what I'm hoping that you take away, is just maybe an appreciation for the complexity of the problem that they dealt with. Maybe seeing behind the curtain and how a person running the Fed might think about policy and the effects of it when they're dealing with record high inflation, as Mr. Volcker was in 1979, 1980 when he joined the Fed. And then also just maybe learn a few things you just didn't know about the era. Maybe they make you more interested to learn more, maybe give you a new perspective about the data. So that's what we're going to do today, friends. Hope you like the presentation I've put together. I made a slide deck for us, so it's nice and organized. I'm going to read a bunch of different excerpts. We'll have some visuals to go along with it. So relax, chat amongst yourselves, or yourself a beverage if you like. Cozy up next to a fire with your loved ones. Maybe sit on some kind of a bear skin rug, maybe a zebra skin if you're into that kind of thing. And let's talk about Tall Paul, the Dragon Slayer. Paul Volcker was a tall man. I think he was 6'6", 6'7". He died just a few years ago at the ripe old age of 92. And this guy was really important because he wasn't just the chair of the Federal Reserve at the beginning of the 1980s when we had the highest inflation we've had in multiple generations. He was around for many important moments in U.S. monetary and financial history in the second half of the 20th century. He was the he was the chairman of the Fed, obviously, but before that, he was the president of the Federal Reserve Bank in New York for a few years. But before that, even, he worked as the undersecretary under Richard Nixon. He was heavily involved in Nixon deciding to close the gold window, which basically collapsed the Bretton Woods system. Volcker was heavily involved in that. He was involved in the years following that when countries switched to floating exchange rates in the wake of Bretton Woods. And he was deeply involved in a lot of the negotiations in that period about how to restructure the world economic system and if we need some kind of an organized system. And that book, Changing Fortunes, which we're going to look at here together today, talks a lot about that and many of his other kind of trials and tribulations working with the U.S. government. But the chapter about inflation is the one that we're going to focus on today. And because I think it's particularly relevant for the cycle that we're in, obviously, anyone who's been watching the channel for a while knows we're in an inflationary cycle with the risk of recession. In an inflationary cycle, the Fed acts a particular way because that is the revival of their nemesis. Inflation is their nemesis. And so studying the era of Volcker, when we have Jerome Powell as the chair today, when inflation has come back, is particularly interesting, as you will find out throughout this presentation, because Powell is kind of an acolyte of Mr. Volcker. So here we have a little political cartoon to start it off. This is an inflation dragon and a woman here hiding in the grocery aisle. The book that we're going to read some excerpts from today, again, is called Changing Fortunes. It was co-written by Paul Volcker and Toyo Guillotin, who was a policymaker in Japan from the same era. And they're friends, and they kind of trade off different sections in the book, but we're just going to read from Paul Volcker today. So before the book, the reason we ended up with inflation are numerous, and we could have whole episodes studying different facets of the period leading up to when Paul Volcker actually took the reins, which was over here. We had multiple years of inflationary spikes. Arthur Burns was the chair of the Fed from 1970 until this period right here. Then we had a guy named Bill Miller for a couple of years, and then Volcker came in. Arthur Burns, we're going to do a whole episode about him at some point, I think, because there's some really fascinating shit to know about Arthur Burns. He was heavily influenced politically by Richard Nixon. They were buddies, and there's a lot of documented bullying of Arthur Burns by Richard Nixon. And it's fascinating period to read about, especially because right after Arthur Burns left the Fed, again, like right around this period, a couple years later, he gave a speech. It's called The Anguish of Central Banking. And it's one of my favorite things to read because it really lets you into the mind of an important policymaker during one of the most volatile and fascinating periods of U.S. history. So one day we're going to read The Anguish of Central Banking, or at least parts of it, and we'll talk about Arthur Burns. But today, just know that throughout the 60s, several things happened, right? It really began in 61 with JFK coming into office. He was the first real Keynesian president. But obviously his term was cut short. LBJ comes in, continuing those ideas, greatly expanding government spending with what he called his Great Society movement. Tons of government programs came out of this. He signed the Civil Rights Act, Social Security was created, and the government, just nanny state, grew tremendously as well, and in some ways in permanent ways. The Vietnam War came in the middle part of the 1960s. That added to the kindling. Then we had two Middle Eastern oil crises in 1973 and 1979. Both of those added to inflationary forces that were building from these other things that had already been happening. I said LBJ started these ideas and the spending, but don't get it twisted. Nixon came in the 70s. He just continued a lot of those same things. They really didn't stop. And because, like I said with Arthur Burns, he ended up easing policy a couple of times prematurely, caving to political pressure, and it helped to stoke inflation throughout the decade. We had some different dynamics with the U.S. We had much stronger demographics. We had the boomer generation becoming adults, and there was a lot of real organic demand in the U.S. We also had high unemployment because we had so many new people entering the workforce, female empowerment, and just a ton of new young people. So it was just a volatile period that we had way more labor supply than we have labor demand, which is the actual opposite of today. Today we have way more labor demand than we have labor supply. And these things set up what ultimately ended with Paul Volcker coming in 1979 and dealing with a massive shit show of a complete loss of confidence. The public no longer had any belief in the credibility of the Fed or anyone in Washington to deal with inflation. Now we begin with the words of Paul Volcker, and the next few slides will be Volcker's words directly from the book, Changing Fortunes. Volcker came in 1979. He says, I was a little surprised when I got a call. This is when he is as the president of the New York Fed. I was a little surprised when I got a call asking me to see the president. I went to Washington without any particular expectation, mainly concerned that the president not be under any misunderstanding of my own concern about the importance of an independent central bank and the need for tighter money, tighter than Bill Miller had wanted. Bill Miller was the guy on his way out of the Fed. And this right here, this first part, is shade thrown at Arthur Burns because he'd really undermined the credibility of the central bank throughout the 70s by not being as tight as he should have been and allowing inflation to continue from the perspective of Volcker. A couple days later, after delivering this message to President Jimmy Carter himself, a telephone ringing woke me, and Mr. Carter asked me to become chairman. Inflation had been picking up since the Vietnam War period. It plainly had become firmly embedded in popular expectations. Those were the days when not just fine art, but almost any category of collectible had become a prime investment medium. The intensity of the inflation, of course, had something to do with the intensity of the two oil crises. But it was also certainly connected with a feeling that things were out of control and with the international instability of the dollar. It's interesting here when he mentions how fine art and almost any category of collectible became a prime investment medium. For those of y'all who remember the Sunday stream we did recently talking about paper money manias, we talked a lot about how markets started applying fictitious values to things, and hard assets and things of scarcity became in high demand because of the debasement of the money and a lot of the financial instability being created by the authorities. It's the same kind of thing that he's talking about right here, right? You just see the same parallels over and over. Anyway, we'll continue. Now, one can argue about just why all these problems had piled up, but one thing was clear to me at the time. If all the difficulties growing out of inflation were going to be dealt with at all, it would have to be through monetary policy. It wasn't just that other policies seemed to be caught in a sort of political paralysis, but that no other approach could be successful without a convincing demonstration that monetary restraint would be maintained. Again, more shade at Arthur Burns. And not too long after he gets into office, Volcker runs into some media drama quite similar to what we've been seeing in today's cycle. Some tightening had been undertaken in July 1979, and there was further tightening in August after I officially assumed my new office. A much more important event, as it turned out, was the Federal Reserve Board's decision to approve a further increase in the discount rate by 0.5% in mid-September, a second increase in only 4 weeks. But the significance lay not in the change itself, but the way it was interpreted. The vote for the change, the vote to increase the interest rate, after some considerable discussion, was 4-3. There was no reason for me to believe that further steps to tighten could not be taken when and if I was prepared to make the case for them. But the press and the market didn't see it that way. To them, the split vote meant hesitation, and it gave the impression that this would be the board's last move to tighten money. The whole maneuver was counterproductive, and it sent a message that inflation could not be or would not be dealt with very strongly. So in comes this guy. He's very serious about tight money. He has every intention of doing whatever he needs to. But the first vote to raise interest rates comes out with a 4-3 split vote. And that because the media is so dialed in, because they've been dealing with inflation for literally a decade. It's just crazy. People are going nuts. It's absolute mayhem in regards to prices. Things are rising 10-15% a year across the board. It's a bad time, right? And the split vote just was like, oh great, this new guy came in and they can't even agree to raise interest rates when inflation is like 11%. Fuck this guy. And so that worked against him almost immediately upon getting into office. And he even says right here, there was no reason for me to believe that I wouldn't take further steps to tighten, but the press just saw the split vote as counterproductive, and they immediately thought, oh, that's the last chance they're going to tighten any money. Doesn't that feel kind of similar to today with everyone super dialed in on everything the Fed is doing? So we continue. That made a large impression on me because it was further confirmation what I long sensed. After years of failed or prematurely truncated efforts to deal with inflation, markets had developed a high degree of cynicism about the willingness of what they dismissed as Washington in general, or the Fed in particular, to stand firm. In market talk, we always seemed to be behind the curve, reacting too slowly and too mildly only after the evidence was abundantly clear, which by definition was too late. So again, here he is, throwing shade on the prior decade of central bank management and their years of failed and prematurely truncated efforts to deal with inflation. He really was tired of all of this shit. And I think, when you read through the book, you can see he was kind of a principled guy. And for right or wrong, he just felt like you just go and you do the right thing. And the right thing is you need to tighten money and stop inflation, because inflation embeds itself into the economy. It starts working into people's behaviors, and it becomes a serious problem. And we'll get into some of that here in just a bit. In the focus on interest rates lay a psychological trap. With the best staff in the world and all the computing power we could give them, there could never be any certainty about just the right level of the federal funds rate to keep the money supply on the right path and regulate economic activity. So they never quite knew exactly what rate was needed. It's always a little bit of a feel it out kind of game. It's a psychological fact of life, he says, that the risks almost always seem greater in raising interest rates than in lowering them. There's always an asymmetry there. No one likes to risk recession, and that's when the political flack ordinarily hits. So here he's admitting that, even though our job is to maintain stability, we live in this Keynesian world, and there's an asymmetry where we don't want to tighten too much. We'd rather ease too much and then come back in, and there's just kind of a bias towards cutting interest rates rather than tightening interest rates that's like embedded institutionally. There's a tendency to make moves, he says, especially moves to tighten money, only in small increments to test the waters. That may be all fine and prudent when prices and expectations are stable, but in the midst of accelerating inflation, what the Fed might think of as prudent looks to the rest of the world like ineffectual baby steps. We had to be conscious of the warnings of recession, but I, at least, was convinced that that possibility could not be allowed to dominate our decision-making. What was plainly happening over a period of time was that both unemployment and inflation were rising, and further delay in dealing with inflation would only make them worse, including the risk that any recession would be large. So here he's saying, we know there are risks. We realize this is a two-sided problem. We can tighten too much or we can ease too much, and easing too much creates inflation. Tightening too much could risk a recession. But we can't be worried about the recession. We need to worry about our mandates and do the right thing. In our eyes, whatever we think the right thing is. Here's a picture of him. That's Volcker right there. Here's Ben Bernanke. This is the guy who was the Fed chair during the Great Financial Crisis. Here's Alan Greenspan. He was the Fed chair from 1987, when we had the flash crash, all the way until 2004, I believe, right before the GFC, something like that, 2004, 2005. And here's Janet Yellen. A dragon slayer is born. Paul Volcker, there's all these if you look up Paul Volcker pictures on Google, like 80% of them are him chiefing on big ass cigars and blowing smoke clouds while giving congressional testimony. He's just a boss in that way. So here he is. This is more Volcker. So I decided to go ahead. calling a secret meeting of the Open Market Committee on Saturday, October 6th of 1979. As anticipated, several of the regional bank presidents were eager to proceed, other members of the Fed board. And I spent a good part of the meeting insisting that before we voted, the consequences must be fully understood, including the possibility of much higher interest rates in the short run. Then and later, the volatility of interest rates bothered me more than many of the other members of the Open Market Committee. The majority of them insisted that we shouldn't place any real limits on the extent to which interest rates might move. But the committee did set out wide ranges where if the interest rates went beyond them, we might have to reconsider our policy. We meant to slay the inflationary dragon. So let me explain a little bit about what they were trying to do here. Typically, they were targeting interest rates specifically. They would set the interest rate at a specific bound, and they would hope that it would produce certain outcomes in the economy. And it was mostly about, okay, how do we set the right interest rate so that it produces X, Y, and Z outcome? But it seemed to Paul Volcker that it was important not to put so much of the focus on the interest rate itself, but to shift the focus of the conversation towards the growth of the money supply. But the money supply can't be directly controlled. You can only you can move other levers because we're not a command control economy. We're not China. So you can't directly control the entire growth of credit in commercial banks. But rather than control interest rates, he wanted to make the focus about the money supply. And so what they decided to do was embark on something that at the time was considered quite radical, where they would try to target a very specific range of money supply growth. And in doing so, they would expand the range that they allowed the Fed funds rate to bounce around in. Because the Fed funds rate is a market rate, and it's set in a range. And if you look at what the Fed does today, they set the Fed funds rate in a very small range. It's like a 25 basis point, 50 basis point range sometimes, usually 25. But what Volcker and them embarked upon was an experiment where they set very wide ranges, like multiple percentage point ranges. And they would check back in with the market occasionally and see if allowing higher volatility in rates and a higher market set rate in general would bring down the growth of the money supply, essentially allow the market to correct itself a bit at the risk of creating more volatility. And so they knew that they were about to embark on this. Volcker was nervous about it, but they really didn't know what exactly would happen because they had never done this before. Excuse me. We soon learned that any dreams we might have had of changing public expectations by the force of our own convictions about them were just that, dreams. One telltale sign of our difficulty was that when short-term interest rates rose as we anticipated, long-term interest rates rose also. If the markets were convinced that inflation was going to come down, presumably that wouldn't have happened, at least not for long. Sorry, my water went down the wrong pipe, like right as I started to read that. So they knew interest rates would rise, but they thought that if they were rebuilding credibility with the markets, that they would see a fall in the long-term rate in like the 10-year. But what you can see over here, the 10 years in green, and here's 1980. Here's where they started this experiment. Interest rates take off. The Fed funds rate takes off. They expand the range. It becomes much more volatile. And long-term rates also became more volatile, but they continued climbing, in part because there was a kind of a momentum behind market forces and because they hadn't built any credibility with the market. Just because they came out and they said, hey, we're going to try this experiment. We're just going to let rates be in a much wider range. We might see more volatility. They might go higher than you've seen before, but it's because we're dead serious about slowing the growth of the money supply. It's about the money supply growth. And so they thought that message alone would build some positive momentum, but it didn't do anything really. Here's where it gets kind of interesting, I think. Moreover, he says, the general level of interest rates reached higher levels than I or my colleagues had really anticipated. I would not have had support for deliberately raising short-term rates that much. More important, With interest rates so high and volatile, it was hard to say we had achieved much constructive uncertainty in the markets of the kind that I thought we needed to slow down lending and speculation. Most disconcerting of all, while the money supply behaved more or less as we had intended for the rest of the year, like it started to slow down a bit, the inflationary momentum actually increased by early 1980. With consumer prices rising at an annual rate of 15%, there was a palpable sense of growing political panic and economic distress. I think it's fascinating right here when he says, I would not have had support for deliberately raising short-term rates that much. A lot of times when people talk about the Volcker disinflation and they talk about him and him slaying the inflation dragon, using his own words, we meant to slay the inflationary dragon. They talk about it as if he came in and he's like, oh, inflation is 16%. Make the Fed funds rate 19%. We're going to whip this fucker's ass. That's kind of like the way people characterize him, like he was a cowboy and he came in and he wrangled the beast. But they embarked on a very risky policy that had not been tried before. They didn't know what would happen. It created more volatility than they thought it would. Rates went higher than they expected. And it went so high, he was even like, look, I would not have even been able to get support to do what I did. Rates went all the way up here, and it wasn't even like he wanted them to. Like, they set a bigger range, and the market took them there in order to bring about what the Fed said they were trying to achieve. And it's kind of fascinating, I think, because it just makes it, I think, it brings about a more human element to what they did. It makes Volcker seem more like a real person and less like some superhuman figure who came in and just knew exactly the right thing to do. He didn't know the right thing to do. They tried something quite risky because he had the support of the president. And as you'll see here in a moment, it didn't really go exactly the way they thought it would at first. So, as he's mentioning here, inflationary momentum continued. The CPI is in blue, and you can see it continued rising into the early part of 1980 right here, going as high as almost 15%. And then President Jimmy Carter decided to introduce credit controls. Here's where things got a little dicey. Interest rates moved still higher, with the commercial bank prime lending rate reaching the unheard of level of 15.25% in early February 1980. But the monthly inflation rate was almost as high, 14.9. We at the Fed saw no alternative other than tightening again. The administration did not object. The president thought it crucially important to bring his message home to the average American. He wanted to impose direct controls on the use of consumer credit. That didn't seem to make a lot of sense to us at the Federal Reserve. I repeatedly conveyed our concerns to the president and his staff, but in the end, I found it impossible to resist an implied argument that when the president had publicly supported our risky and unprecedented monetary policy, and then he's responding with our urging that he take tough steps to tighten the budget, we at the Fed felt we should respect his political judgment that consumer credit controls were what was necessary to convey urgency. So he felt a little trapped by Jimmy Carter letting him try this thing with interest rates. He felt like he was obligated to support this harebrained idea about credit controls. So they worked on a package. And by March of 1980, remember, just a month or two into the year, he's only been Fed chair for like 6 months at this point. The whole package was unwrapped at a big White House ceremony. The new budget, the credit controls, and the Fed tightening. The economy promptly went into a nosedive. Through all the interest rate increases of the prior 6 months, the economy had kept growing, but now the bottom just fell out, literally within a matter of days. Here's a look at consumer loans. You see here they just absolutely plummet just a couple months into 1980. When we were able to go back and look closely at the data, Volcker says, what jumped out was that all of a sudden, after the president's announcements, consumers just stopped spending. No one had ever seen anything like it. The consumer credit controls we decided upon were not intended to bite hard, and mechanically they did not. But the president was interpreted as saying that the country was in a national emergency and that consumer spending should be restrained. So a lot of consumers stopped spending. They certainly stopped using credit cards, some cutting up their cards into little pieces and sending them to the White House saying, "Mr. President, we will cooperate." After all the trouble we had trying to stop the money supply from increasing, it suddenly dropped precipitously. We could only catch up with it, like the decline in the economy itself, once we got the statistics a few weeks later. As soon as the magnitude of the drop became apparent, money was eased, but there was a lot of criticism that we hadn't moved fast enough. We were willing to put the country through the agony of high interest rates when inflation was raging, but we weren't doing enough to prevent a crash. So they really got into a tight pickle here. They initially start this experiment, this risky experiment where rates go up way higher than they thought they would. And even Volcker himself, who's like, whoa, that surprised me a bit. And then Carter says, you know what? People don't take this seriously. I think we need to come out and we need to issue credit controls and we need to tell them that this is a big deal. And the economy absolutely takes a shit, a big steamy shit. It falls incredibly fast in like a period of 2 or 3 months. And you can see here consumer spending just drops off a cliff. People actually believed Jimmy Carter. They cut up their credit cards and mailed them to him and were like, "We'll do whatever you say, bro. We got this." Because they had been dealing with inflation for like 15 years. They were exhausted. They needed a respite. They had tried thing after thing, administration after administration, and finally this guy's like, "Look, we're at DEFCON 1 on credit." And they believed him. Here you can see real GDP in the first part of 1980 just plummeting. He says, "We eased a lot. The Fed funds rate went from 20% to 8% in only 3 months. We removed the consumer credit controls at the beginning of July 1980. Interest rates stabilized and the money supply began increasing again. Only later, listen to this, only later did we or anyone else realize that the economy was rebounding almost as fast as it had declined." And if you'll look over here at real GDP, look at this. It falls off a cliff at 7.5%, and then it bounces back exactly the same way 2 quarters in a row. So they eased off the pedal. They did what Arthur Burns did multiple times. They eased off the pedal. And then later that year, they saw inflation ticking back up from 10%. Look at this axis here. Inflation's in blue, right? The year over year figure. It's still way up here. They're cutting interest rates, and inflation's still up here at 15%. They cut them all the way back down. I guess I moved ahead too far. They see it bounce right here at 12.5%. Long-term interest rates start rising, and then they have to start tightening again. It's a big mess, basically, because as he says, when we go back and look at the data, customers just stopped spending. So we eased a lot. We cut Fed funds from 20% to 8% in 3 months, removed all the credit controls. But we didn't realize the economy started bouncing back just as quickly as it had declined. It's all recorded in the books as a recession, he says. But in retrospect, it was kind of an odd, accidental occurrence. There was a sharp decline in production, but it only lasted 4 months. What seems to have happened is that a bunch of customers decided to pay off their debts. So both spending and cash balances, which is the money supply, fell suddenly. As the fright about an economic emergency dissipated and the credit controls were lifted, spending and the money supply picked right back up. The net result might not have been much of a recession in 1980, but there also wasn't much progress against inflation either. Like you would think in a recession, you would get a steeper drop in CPI if it was really effective. But just during the course of the recession right here of the gray bar, look how little it falls as opposed to what it does when they get the second recession over here. Inflation continued running at double-digit levels, and with the money supply rising strongly again, we were in the uncomfortable position of tightening money and raising the discount rate only a few weeks before an election. It was small comfort that Ronald Reagan, the candidate, criticized the Fed for being too easy. So we got this candidate coming in, Reagan, who actually supports the idea of tight money. So we'll get into here in a minute, Reagan was supportive of Volcker when they got into the second recession. But it's interesting here. I like this part. We were in the uncomfortable position of having to tighten right before an election. The Fed doesn't like to be political. Even though they deal with politics, like they have to listen to the opinions of the president, but they are supposed to be independent and they're supposed to make their own decisions. But they get caught up in those whirlwinds. They're in the same city, for fuck's sake. I don't think that was kind of interesting there, because that's similar to what we're dealing with this year, right? The Fed is potentially thinking about having to reverse their policy and pivot to easing with sticky inflation. It's nowhere near the inflation they were dealing with back here. We're talking about 3, 4, 5% CPI this year, maybe at the worst case, if it goes up a couple more percent. Back here it was double digits. So it's obviously a different scenario, but this is high inflation for us, and we're now in an election year, and we're looking at the Fed about maybe starting to turn their policy, and they're caught in a trap, as we talked about in the prior stream, where they don't want to get political. If they ease, they're going to be seen as helping the incumbent. If they tighten, they will be seen as helping the challenger, and not either way. Whichever administration comes in will see that the Fed was political, and that will not go well for them, especially in a cycle that is already so volatile and needs an independent Fed more than one that is captive, I would think. And I would imagine central bankers would think too. The new Reagan administration supported tight money. As Volcker says, at one point in the darkest days of the Carter administration, the lack of confidence was symbolized by the gold price soaring above $800 an ounce and wild speculation in silver. Occasionally, there were demonstrations around the Fed headquarters, and for a while my office was deluged with sawed-off wooden 2x4s in a campaign organized by home builders to lower interest rates and stimulate their business. So people were actually mailing planks from like abandoned construction projects to the Eccles building in Washington to intimidate and show the message to the Fed that they needed lower rates because it was hurting their business as home builders. By the time Reagan came in January 1981, monetary policy was once again fully engaged in restraint. The administration supported our efforts to restrain money growth in 1981, even at the expense of ferociously high interest rates. So Volcker has it a little different from Arthur Burns. As we'll learn when we talk about Mr. Burns, he was under heavy political pressure throughout his tenure because his buddy Richard Nixon was the president who appointed him. And from the minute Arthur Burns was appointed Fed chair, literally, you can watch the video on YouTube, on the Associated Press YouTube channel, the video of Arthur Burns being announced as the Fed chair by Richard Nixon. Nixon is putting the pressure on him on the stage, being like, hey, yeah, you see all these people clapping? That is a vote of confidence for you to lower interest rates and give us more money. Like, he literally says that to him, and you see Arthur Burns kind of like throw his head back and give this awkward looking laugh. He did not have the support of the administration to run tight money during an inflationary era. Volcker came in with the explicit mandate of doing that. Carter tried to help him, but the credit controls were a terrible idea. And they created a really sharp drop-off because people actually believed Carter because they were just completely beaten down morale-wise, and they were just looking for someone to show leadership. And Carter's idea was, in bad form. But then Reagan comes in, and to the relief, I would say, of Volcker, he actually gives him the fiscal support in at least his first administration to allow tight money to finish the job. He says, I recall the delight with which Treasury Secretary Reagan, not Reagan, but Donald Reagan was the Treasury Secretary, received news that we were about to raise rates in May to help deal with a bulge in the money supply, even though, as it turned out, that was very close to the peak in business activity. So, if we go back here, You'll see here's where they start raising rates again, and it's in the middle part of 1980. By the time Reagan gets there, it's 1981. It's like right here, and the Fed's already tightened money a bit, right? You can see the Fed funds rate chops around, but remember I said they didn't set it at a specific level. It has a range. So it's all the way back up here. The Fed has tightened money. They've lifted the range back up higher again. Long-term rates are rising. Inflation's coming down a bit, but you see it spikes a little, but they've made money tight, and the new president has come in and he has given them his blessing, so to speak, that he's not going to undermine their efforts. And you can see he mentions here, I recall with delight when the Treasury Secretary heard me say we're going to raise rates in May because of money supply growth, but that was close to the peak in business activity. He's talking about May 1981, which is right here. And the interesting thing is here's early 1981. This is real retail sales in blue and manufacturing and trade sales in red. These are the two series that we look at for cyclical economy growth in our recession modeling that we look at together. So I thought it would be interesting to show these, and you can see how both of them peak here right after the early part of 81, and they start rolling over. And that aligns with what Volcker says here. They were going to raise rates in May, but it was close to the peak in business activity. Here is where Volcker talks about one of his most important points, and that is the idea of price stability. This is a concept really championed by Paul Volcker. And after the experience of the 70s into the 1980s, and with the great Volcker disinflation, it really changed the thinking around policymakers and their research and their economic modeling. And they started thinking more about the importance of price stability and its effects on people's behaviors in the market and inflation expectations. Not just inflation itself and its effect on money supply growth and buying power and things like that, but how also psychologically it can embed itself in the expectations of people. It can start affecting the way that they save, the way that they invest. It can affect their morale, and you can just start having a lot of secondary and tertiary effects if you allow inflation to embed itself societally. People just expect it in their lives. So here's Volcker's own words talking about this concept. In the end, there's only one excuse for pursuing such strongly restrictive monetary policies. It's the simple conviction that over time, the economy will work better, more efficiently, and more fairly, with better prospects and more saving in an environment of reasonable price stability. In a speech in San Francisco in December of 1983, I defined reasonable price stability as a situation where ordinary people don't feel that they have to take the expectations of price increases into account when making their investment plans and running their lives. Inflation just exists in the background harmlessly. It's not something that they have to constantly build into their financial calculus. He goes on, after the Great Depression, a lot of economists thought it was a good thing to have a slight bias toward inflation, thinking that it would pep things up a bit, that it would encourage spending and new investment. The trouble is that when everyone expects inflation and interest rates go up in anticipation, the temptation always remains to speed up the inflation a little more, if not deliberately, then for fear that restraint will cause a recession. In the end, there will all too likely be a still bigger recession and more agony in restoring stability. That was the situation at the start of the 1980s. So as he says right here, the temptation always remains to speed up the inflation a little more, if not deliberately, then for fear that restraint will cause a recession. That's very similar to the asymmetry he mentioned earlier back here. The risks always seem greater in raising rates than in lowering them. No one likes to risk recession, and that's when the political flack ordinarily hits. So he even talks about that back there. And so this concept of price stability is really important to Volcker, and he championed these ideas. And like I said, they really embedded themselves institutionally in the frameworks, and you started getting a lot more research, not just out of the Fed, but just out of economic researchers everywhere. And the thinking around these concepts started to focus a lot on inflation expectations. And that concept was born out of the idea of price stability and its secondary and tertiary effects. The ultimate goal was to defeat expectations. Volcker says, "We are all perfectionists. Looking back, there is a certain amount of second guessing about whether we were too slow to ease in 1982. Maybe, they say, the recession could have been ended a few months earlier. Perhaps that's true, but those arguments do not impress me very much. It's not that our policies were perfection, but that the far greater error at that point would have been to fail to follow through long enough to affect fundamental attitudes and really put inflationary expectations to rest." So those are all of the excerpts that I want to read to you from Changing Fortunes. Before we conclude today, I have a couple of more points here related to this, tying them to Jerome Powell. So we talk here about the concept of price stability and how important it is because you don't want that calculus to be built into people's lives. And what's really fascinating is that Jerome Powell is a longtime known admirer of Paul Volcker. Here is an excerpt from a Forbes article from 2019. It says, "Some months after Jerome Powell became Fed Reserve Chair in early 2018, the former attorney and longtime investment banker began carrying around a new memoir by Paul Volcker called Keeping at It. He says, I actually thought I should buy 500 copies of his book and just hand them out at the Fed, Powell quipped at a conference in 2019. I didn't do that, but it's a book I strongly recommend, and we can all hope to live up to some part of who he is." Testifying before Congress earlier this month in March of 2022, Jay Powell was asked if the Fed Reserve was prepared to do what it takes to get inflation back under control, and if necessary, follow in the footsteps of his venerated predecessor Paul Volcker, who regained price stability at all costs. Calling the late Volcker, quote, "the greatest economic public servant of the era," quote, Powell responded, "I hope history will record the answer to your question is yes." So Powell loves Paul Volcker, read his book, carried around at the Fed, said he was going to give out copies to everyone, calls him the greatest public servant of the era. And that's interesting because as we've been going through this inflationary cycle, there have been multiple moments throughout press conferences and interviews. I just found a couple here. I know that there are others, but I couldn't find them all in time to make this slide deck. But I'll show you a couple of them here. But Powell's made multiple references to ideas of Volcker's, in some cases using very similar language that shows that he really studies him closely. In the same way that we can find parallels when we look at paper money manias across centuries and we see kind of similar language, you can pick up some of the coded kind of phrasing and things that Powell uses, not coded, but some of the phrasing he uses that's very similar to Volcker. Here he says, this is FOMC in May of 2022, so just 2 months into the hiking cycle. Ultimately, getting supply and demand back in balance is what gives us 2% inflation, which is what gives the economy a footing where people can lead successful economic lives and not worry about inflation. So yes, there may be some pain associated with getting back to that, but the big pain over time is in not dealing with inflation and allowing it to become entrenched. The far greater error would have been to fail to follow through long enough to affect fundamental attitudes and really put inflationary expectations to rest. That's Paul Volcker. The big pain over time is not dealing with inflation and allowing it to become entrenched. That's Jerome Powell. In July, just a couple months later, there would be the risk of doing too much and imposing more of a downturn on the economy than's necessary, but the risk of doing too little and leaving the economy with this entrenched inflation only raises the costs. So here he's again talking about the asymmetry, right? The asymmetry between no one wants to risk a recession, but there are trade-offs here. If you fail to deal with it in the near term, it only raises the cost of dealing with it later to the extent that people start to see it as part of their economic lives. Here again, he's talking about price stability and not creating expectations of inflation. They start to factor high inflation into their decisions. When that, on a sustained basis, starts to really happen, it just gets that much harder, and the pain will be that much greater. So then you fast forward one more month from this to August 2022. Hold on one second. August 2022 is the Jackson Hole Symposium, which is where a bunch of central bankers get together every year and they glad hand and clap each other on the back and congratulate one another on being the world's most powerful monetary fucks. In August of 2022, as CPI had crested just a couple of months earlier, but it was still, I think, around 7.5%, 8%. Jerome Powell came out because there had been a couple of months in a row of the S&P bouncing really strongly in the middle of the summer, in part because of language from the Fed in July, which suggested that they were going to be more data dependent. People actually thought there was going to be a Fed pivot sometime soon, even though CPI was at 9% in June. Just completely nuts, right? People far too dialed into the Fed, kind of similar to what Volcker dealt with on like day one in office, which we read about a little while ago. So here are some quotes from Powell during a very short 8-minute Jackson Hole speech. This is where he usually talks for like 20, 30 minutes. And he talked for 8 minutes, and he was very, very brief. He says, during the 1970s, as inflation climbed, the anticipation of high inflation became entrenched in economic decision-making. The more inflation rose, the more people came to expect it to remain high, and they built that belief into wage and pricing decisions. Here he actually references Volcker, as former Chairman Paul Volcker put it at the height of the Great Inflation. Inflation feeds in part on itself, so part of the job of returning to a more stable and productive economy must be to break the grip of inflationary expectations. When inflation is persistently high, households and businesses must pay close attention and incorporate it into their economic decisions. When inflation is low and stable, they are freer to focus their attention elsewhere. Here he is preaching the gospel of price stability per Paul Volcker's own exact framing. We must keep at it until the job is done. Remember this phrase. We must keep at it until the job is done. History shows that the employment costs of bringing down inflation are likely to increase with our delay, meaning that the trade-off is we will have higher unemployment the longer we wait to deal with inflation, as high inflation becomes more entrenched in wage and price setting. The successful Volcker disinflation in the early 1980s followed multiple failed attempts to lower inflation over the previous 15 years. Here he's talking about Arthur Burns and Bill Miller's failures in the 1970s to deal with inflation. A lengthy period of restrictive monetary policy was needed to stem that high inflation and start the process of getting it down to low and stable levels that were the norm until the spring of last year. He's talking about 2021. Our aim at the Fed is to avoid that outcome by acting with resolve. These lessons are guiding us as we use our tools to bring down inflation. We're taking forceful and rapid steps to moderate demand so it comes into better alignment with supply. He says that so many times. We will keep at it until we are confident the job is done. We will keep at it until we are confident the job is done. Paul Volcker's autobiography is called Keeping at It. Thought we would end here on a political cartoon that I just thought was awesome. This is the last 5 Fed chairs: Paul Volcker, Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, Janet Yellen, Jerome Powell. Red are interest rates. And what's kind of funny is that until Jerome Powell, the last 4 Fed chairs had been declining in height, while interest rates had been declining from their peak at Paul Volcker, who just happened to be 6'7". Well, now Jerome Powell is an average of 6 feet. He's much taller than Janet Yellen's diminishing 5 feet. And now rates are rising again. I just love this political cartoon. So that's my presentation for you guys today. I love studying history, and I love finding parallels. I think there are so many interesting lessons to be learned. And some of the key takeaways for me in studying the Volcker disinflation are that it was an experiment. They didn't know what they were going to get. People had been so beaten down by years and years of high inflation and government mismanagement and political pressure bowing the independent Fed and not allowing them to finish the job. And so when Volcker came in, it was just an absolute shit show. He tried to take it seriously at first, and even Carter joined in with that harebrained credit control idea. But things went south really quickly. And I think it's remarkable how he did the same thing that Arthur Burns was guilty of more than once, but he then corrected it, right? He had the same conviction, and he actually believed his convictions would work. It happened too quickly, right? It got out of control. It created an uncontrollable slide, and he had to stop it. But once he settled back in, he created an outcome that actually led to multiple decades of expansion. But it was a really painful recession that we had to go through in that period. People have debated about whether that was necessary. But even as Volcker's own words are, or later on, he says the people say maybe we were too slow to ease, but those arguments don't impress me, because more important would be not to be taken seriously. Because the whole problem, as we saw when he first came into office, was that no one took the Fed seriously. Even on his first interest rate rise, because the vote was a split, the media was like, this guy's a clown. He's just like the last guy. This is the last time they're going to raise interest rates, even though inflation is at like 14%. So he had to bring the hammer down. And I think it's interesting because it was an experiment in policy in general. They didn't set the rates. They just created a bigger fence for the rates to play in, and they let the market kind of sort itself out. And even Volcker remarked, like, man, that went a lot faster than I thought it was going to. And so, when we talk about the Volcker disinflation, it's important to note he was an imperfect man. He was very intelligent, and he clearly had some integrity in standing by his belief and his vision. And feeling like he was doing the right thing. But it wasn't, he wasn't superhuman, and he second guessed himself a lot. And it just kind of happened to work out a little bit. But when we see what Powell is dealing with today, him invoking Volcker, it's a bit off-putting because, we're in a very different place than we were under Paul Volcker. Debt to GDP is 4 times as large. The deficit is about 3 times as large relative to GDP. And our demographic situation is not as robust. We don't have as much demographic elasticity so that we can bounce back really well from a downturn. We have a really tight labor supply. We have an inadequate supply of labor for the demands of a full-service economy, a full-scale economy. We don't have enough people to fulfill all the jobs. If we did, we wouldn't have job openings, and we would have higher unemployment. We have the opposite. That's not the dynamics that Volcker was dealing with. Very high unemployment. Like in Volcker's era, unemployment was 8, 9, 10%. Very different scenario to what we're dealing with today. So when Powell invokes Volcker, you can tell that he's trying to send the message that he is serious and that he'll do whatever is necessary. But at no point, I think, does it mean that he's going to do what Volcker did and say interest rates are going to 15%. That was sometimes what was characterized in what Powell was aiming for. And it just never quite rang true to me knowing this information here. So I hope you found this interesting. I hope you learned some things you'd never known before. Maybe it inspires you to study this era a little bit deeper and see if you can find some other things. There are many other angles we could take to this. Paul Volcker is not the only reason that inflation went down. Another major reason that inflation went down is because in the early 1980s, non-OPEC oil production exploded because of the effects of the Middle Eastern oil crises in the 70s that we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation and that Volcker mentioned. And so that was a huge reason why inflation came down, is because we greatly increased the energy supply in non-OPEC regions. So we could go down that rabbit hole. We can go down the rabbit hole of Arthur Burns and the mistakes he made, which I absolutely want to do because I think it's a fascinating thing. Now that you see what Volcker dealt with, you saw the mess that he had to mop up. We should go back and look at how it was created, or at least some of the ways. We're not going to capture it all, but we can maybe look at some of the ways it was created, some of the things that happened with Arthur Burns, some of the talks that are documented between him and Nixon on video that are recorded on the Nixon tapes. Just interesting stuff that might give you a more rounded or just new perspective on the complexity of the 1970s. So, all right, that's where I'm going to wrap it up here. Nice and tidy 1 hour stream. Got about 100 concurrent viewers. Please make sure you smash the like button. Let me catch up on the stream activity because I saw some things popping off and I have to give credit where credit is due. Andy Philpott is a member for 2 months. Thank you, Andy. CB is a member for 3 months. Says thank you for this TXMC. Appreciate you, man. Thank you so much. Or chick or dude, whoever you are. Thank you. Chris in Akumal, I hope I say that correctly, gifted a membership. Thank you, Chris. Whomever received that gift will be able to join the member stream later this week. And then Andy Philpott, what a boss. Andy Philpott came in with 10 gifted memberships. Amazing. Every one of you, thank you to Andy. Andy is one of the OGs around here. He's always gifted memberships. CB's gifted a few. I think Chris has gifted a few. Thank you, everyone. Much appreciated. Very generous. All of you who received those, make sure you're here when we do our next stream, which tentatively should be about Thursday, where we'll actually talk about the market. We won't just talk about history. And then we'll do a member stream right after that where we can do more questions and casual chat. Chris donated right after that, says TXMC, what an awesome Sunday afternoon stream. Thank you. That's amazing, man. Y'all are great. Appreciate you all for being here, for supporting the channel as you do. Thank you for giving me a platform. I am going to let you guys go. I shouldn't have pulled that up on the stream there, but that's okay. You guys saw it. It's okay. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. We'll do a stream in about 4 or 5 days. We'll talk about actual market analysis, not 5 days, 4 days, Thursday. If it's any later than that, I'll schedule it beforehand and you'll see it. And then that's where we'll leave it here today. So with that, thank you for being here. As I said, take care of yourselves. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday evening or the beginning of your week if you're on the Eastern Hemisphere. It's kind of a light week on economic data, so hopefully the markets can give us some interesting things to talk about. I will talk to all of you in just a few days. So until then, cheers, everyone.